All right. So this will be day three. Today, what we're going to talk about is Charles Darwin, natural selection, and speciation. So Charles Darwin was a naturalist who sailed around the world into different parts of the world on the HMS Beagle. That was a ship. Some of the big things that he did, he studied different types of finches, which is a type of bird, and tortoises. He wrote the book Origin of a Species from his studies. And the biggest thing that he was talking about here is he was trying to figure out what would actually cause evolution to happen. And that's where he said that the primary mechanism, that means the primary driving force of evolutionary change, is natural selection. Now, remember, we already talked about how natural selection is where nature decides based on what is the ecosystem saying and what challenges are presenting organisms that live there and who's going to survive and meet those challenges. Those advantages. That whole idea is where he developed that term survival of the fittest. The fittest are the ones that are the most adapted and adept to survive. And what he'll refer to that as is as a species, and how natural selection fits in with evolution is that there is a term known as descent with modification. That means that over a long period of time, organisms will start to change and based on those advantages, those traits are passed on, and that causes modifications to the species, creating typically a divergence of species and creating a new species. So, whenever we talked about Darwin's finches, basically what he did is he goes to these islands, the Galapagos Islands, and he starts seeing all these finches, but they all have very unique beak structures, body size, even their feeding behavior is different. And he's wondering, how is this possible for this to have occurred here? This is an isolated area. And basically, finches had to change and adapt. You know, there were finches that had to go after different types of food, and based because it was based on what the environment had to offer. If they all went after the same exact thing, then as a species they would die. So basically, there was a finch one day that's like, man, I don't have what it takes. Let's say if you're this big finch down here versus this warbler finch. Well, instead of being able to use your beak-like tweezers and poke and prod and get it like insects or things like that inside of trees or stumps or whatever, you have this bulkier one that's not allowing you to do that. You're going to start getting hungry as an animal, and you have to figure out what you're going to eat. So basically, he studied these finches and these birds, and that helped him discover and helped him flesh out his ideas of what natural selection actually meant. And he just applied and he came up with them by looking at what they had to do in order to survive. And of course, it was driven by natural selection. So Darwin's theory itself. So basically, living organisms have descended with modifications from species that lived before them, from their ancestors. The reason why they modified is all about survival of the fittest. And the fitness is all about competing for those resources. Whoever has the advantage in that competition for the resource meant that they're going to be able to live and pass on their genetic code. More organisms are produced than can survive because of limited resources. So that's where we talk about carrying capacity in our last unit. So carrying capacity is the amount of resources. Typically what happens is more organisms are actually born that can actually survive there. And as long as that's constantly happening, there's always that competition for resources, meaning that you always have to be the best. You have to. The better adapted organisms are the ones that we call the fittest, and they're more likely to survive, which means they're more likely to reproduce, thereby passing on their traits to the next generation, meaning that that next generation has that fittest trait as well, or should have it. And as things are more competition and more competition, it gets more better and better and better and more adapted to survive in its environment. But remember, if you're not willing to adapt, you're going to end up going extinct. Mechanisms of speciation. What we mean by speciation is how is a new and distinct species actually formed. The mechanism term of that refers to what is causing the new species to diverge or to develop. So some of the ones that we're going to look at, I'll show you in just a second. So basically, if you have reproduction within a species stops for any reason, the population is said to be isolated, such as with the finches. Well, they're island hopping, and the next thing you know, they're on an island that's secluded from the mainland. So they're no longer able to breed with the mainland finches, and so they actually have to adapt to their isolated environment. Or now that's geographical isolation. This is talking about a species that's no longer able to reproduce and create viable offspring. Of course, it's a now example. There's types of squirrels, or I guess maybe they're chipmunks, but I think they're just a squirrel in the Grand Canyon that you've seen this with, that you could look up and see this with. To where the two different types of squirrels are no longer able to reproduce together. Even though they look similar and everything, they're just not able to. As these organisms adapt to their environments, their gene pool changes. Over time, these populations will become more and more different, and the more different they become, they start to create a new species. So the two that we're going to look at is geographical isolationism, or isolation, versus reproductive isolation. Geographical isolation would be the what is causing the speciation. That means that they are geographically isolated by some type of physical barrier, such as the finches example. They're on this island. They're no longer around all the other finches on the main island. They can't get to them. So they have to adapt to their ecosystem, which is slightly different than the mainland, maybe not as many resources. And so they become genetically different than those on the mainland because they have different challenges. Reproductive isolation occurs when members of the different populations can no longer mate successfully together. I haven't checked into this, but I kind of wonder that with the red squirrel and the gray squirrel that we have here in Mississippi. I wonder if they are that type to where they actually started to geographically they're not separated, but they started to change physically and genetically, and then it gets to where they're unable to reproduce between the two species. And then eventually they become a different species by the end of it. Talking about natural selection, that's why this image is here. So this image is actually talking about what happened due to Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, we see this tree here, and it has these different moths on it. And we see that the dark colored moths are actually getting picked off by the bird because the lighter colored moths are actually better camouflaged with the tree. But after the Industrial Revolution, we start seeing in certain areas that more of these trees are getting covered with soot, meaning that the darker colored moths are actually able to survive now and able to thrive, but now the lighter colored moths are the ones that are standing out. That would actually be an example of how people are affecting nowadays, affecting the natural selection process. All right.